Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for joining us. I was asked to talk about the management of Human Rights Watch. And since Globus is known for promoting entrepreneurship, I thought I would talk about the management of an NGO as an entrepreneurial endeavor. Now, you may say for a moment, like, how can you do that? I mean, after all, when you think of an entrepreneur, you think about somebody who has an idea, a business model. They attract capital. They try to attract good employees, and they launch a business and try to make a lot of money. How does that apply to an NGO? It actually applies quite a bit. And I thought I would describe that to you. Now, first, just a few background facts to get us started. Human Rights Watch has been around for 33 years. I've actually been the CEO since 1993, so for, I guess, getting up to close to 20 years. We have an annual budget today of $53 million. And that's been growing very regularly. Last year, we were 48 million. So, basically 10% growth in the last year. We have a staff of 300 employees who were spread around the world. They operated, as you saw, in 90 different countries. So in many ways, we're like a small multinational corporation with a big global reputation. We're known really in most countries around the world where we work. Now, it may seem a little bit odd to talk about an NGO having a business model because obviously we don't make a profit. We don't even sell anything. We give away our reports. But it does nonetheless make sense to talk about running an NGO like a business for several reasons. I mean, first of all, there's the obvious one. We have to have a budget. We have to know how much money we're going to bring in each year to know how much we can spend. We've got to try to deploy those resources as best we can. We have to figure out, where is the revenue going to come from? If we need capital, we have to figure out how to get that. So those are all, typical business concerns. We also have to have a staff. We have to attract employees. Where do those 300 people come from? How do you train them? How do you attract the best people? How do you manage them? Particularly when they're spread out around the world, where you can't just all get together and have a meeting every morning. So these are, the kinds of management issues that you would confront even if you were running a for-profit business. But there's a big challenge that we as an NGO face, which I think is different from that faced by most for-profit corporations. And that is, if you ask about the success of a for-profit organization, where do you start? You start with profit. If the company's profitable, if its stock price is going up, it's a successful company. We don't have any stock, and we don't have any profits. So how do you measure the success of an NGO? The biggest problem for us is demonstrating our impact. In many ways, our impact is the equivalent of what a for-profit corporation might look to as a measurement, its profits. And impact is important for us for a number of different reasons. I mean, first of all, it's our raison d'etre. It's the reason we exist. If we weren't making a difference, there'd be no need for Human Rights Watch. We'd be wasting our time. But demonstrating impact is also essential if we are going to build the organization, if we're going to attract contributions, the revenue that we need to keep the organization going. And I say this because at a certain level, everybody's for human rights. And if I go up to you and say, would you give me, a small contribution to promote human rights, almost everybody will give a little bit because it's a way of saying, yes, I'm for human rights. It's an identity statement. But if you're going to invest in a significant way, I've got to be able to convince you that your money's going to make a difference. People will make small contributions to show that they stand for the right thing. But they won't make a big investment unless they can show or be shown that their investment is going to make people's lives better in different parts of the world. And so that's the biggest challenge that we face in building the organization, is first making that impact, figuring out how we're going to make a difference, and then demonstrating that impact to potential supporters around the world so that they're willing to make big investments. Because frankly, when most people think of an NGO, and I think this is particularly true in Japan, they think of an organization that may be well-meaning, but is soft, it's ineffective, it may be a little marginal, it doesn't really make a difference. And that's the way most people think of an NGO. That's the presumption that we have to overcome. And in fact, and I think you'll see this, that one of the things that does distinguish Human Rights Watch is that we're pretty tough. To use an American term, we play hardball. And we are anything but soft or marginal. But we need to show that to people in order to get them to invest. And that's one of the challenges that we face. Now, let me describe how we're tough. And let me take a moment and describe the methodology of Human Rights Watch. Now, we start not as sort of an ordinary NGO. We start by putting our minds in the position of a dictator. Imagine yourselves a dictator. What do you care about? Well, you care about your reputation. Nobody wants to be known as a dictator. They always want to be known as, the savior of their country and, looking out for the well-meaning of their people, even though we know that they just want to stay in power. They want to make sure that they can make a lot of money, because corruption is usually a big part of being a dictator. So they want to make sure that the international aid keeps flowing. They want to make sure that businesses invest in their country. They certainly want to stay out of jail, right? That's if you're a dictator, you don't want to find yourself in The Hague and suddenly facing prison. You want to be invited to fancy summits so you can drink champagne with global leaders and show how important you are. There are various things that dictators want. Our job at Human Rights Watch is to make it impossible for dictators to get those things so long as they act like dictators. So long as they violate human rights, so long as they commit serious human rights abuses, our job is to make it difficult for the dictator to get what he or she wants. In other words, we raise the cost of human rights abuse. If you're a dictator, it's very convenient to violate human rights. It's a way of shutting down the opposition. It's a way of getting rid of that pesky newspaper that continues to criticize you. It's the way to shut down those political parties that keep asking for elections. There are lots of good reasons to violate human rights from the perspective of a dictator. So when the dictator is sort of making the cost-benefit analysis, should I commit this violation of human rights or not, our job is to raise the cost. Now, how do we do that? It always begins by conducting an investigation into what the dictator is doing. And the largest portion of our staff is composed of people whom we call researchers. These are people, they could be lawyers, they could be journalists, they could be academics. They come from a whole variety of backgrounds. But their job is to become the world's expert on their particular issue, whether it's a certain country or a certain thematic issue. They live in the country or they travel there regularly, and they conduct very detailed on-the-ground investigations. They speak to the victims of human rights abuse. They speak to the eyewitnesses. They talk to the government, so they get the government's point of view. And at the end of this investigation, they write up a report. And this report will be more in-depth, more analytic, more sophisticated, than anything else around. That's their goal. We then take this report, and we issue a lot of reports. We put out probably 2 major reports every week and another, dozen or so shorter reports every single week. Each of these reports we then use to try to put pressure on the dictator, to try to raise the cost of the human rights abuse that otherwise he would want to engage in. Now, how do we do that? Well, I've already alluded to it. One way is we shame the dictator. We shame the government. If it's a rebel group, we shame the rebel group. Because in today's world, nobody wants to be known as a human rights violator. And so if we can highlight those human rights violations, if we can shine a spotlight on them, everybody finds that shameful. And so the dictator wants to go around, and have a great reputation as the savior of his country, but Human Rights Watch is shining a spotlight on his human rights abuses and showing how what he's actually doing is despicable. And that hurts his reputation. It tarnishes his image. It diminishes his standing before his people and before his peers around the world. And dictators hate that. They will go to great lengths to try to avoid it. Usually they start off by simply criticizing us. They say, oh, Human Rights Watch got it wrong. They didn't understand, or Human Rights Watch is biased, or Human Rights Watch talked to the wrong people, or Human Rights Watch has some other agenda. Now, we always win those debates because we're right. We do very careful research. And when we put out a report, we stand behind that report and we know that it's accurate. So the dictator may say, oh, you got it wrong, but any journalist that looks at our report and their denial knows where the truth lies. And so over time, the dictator understands that they are not going to regain their reputation until they end their human rights abuses. That if they want to recapture a positive image, they have to stop the negative human rights violations. So this process of shaming is one way that we raise the cost of human rights abuse, one way that we put pressure on governments to respect rights. Now, a second way that we do it, again, goes to one of these other things that governments want. Dictators, want the benefit of international aid. They want the benefit of good relations with other governments. They want to be invited to fancy summits, the things I just mentioned. We try to prevent that from happening until they change. And so in addition to having researchers in 90 countries around the world, we have what we call advocates in key capitals. My colleague here, Kanai Doi, is the director of our office here in Tokyo. And her job here is very similar to the job of various colleagues in other important capitals around the world. We take our information and we present it to powerful governments. And we say, we want you, powerful government, to use your influence with this dictator to try to force the dictator to stop human rights violations. Now, how do you do that? Well, we may say, why don't you stop sending military aid until the dictator stops killing people? Or why don't you stop those concessional loans until the dictator stops torturing people? Or sometimes it can be, don't invite that dictator to your summit next year until he releases his political prisoners. But there are always things that abusive governments want from the powerful governments of the world. And it could be the Japanese government, it could be the British government, the French government, the German government, the US government, the World Bank. Our job is to make it difficult for the abusive government to get those things, so long as they continue human rights violations. So that's another way that we raise the cost of abuse. Now, the third way that I'll mention has to do with the situations that are really the worst in the world, the places where the dictator or the abusive government is committing atrocities, where they're killing large numbers of people. They're committing war crimes or crimes against humanity or even genocide. And in those situations, we actually try to get people prosecuted. Often you can't get them prosecuted at home because one of the first things that a dictator does is shuts down his own judicial system. So you can't go to the local courts and sue the government because the local judges have already been killed or compromised. But you can go to The Hague. You can go to the International Criminal Court or to similar international tribunals that have been established. And there, Human Rights Watch works very closely with these prosecutors. We will provide them with evidence of the war crimes that our researchers have collected in the field. We will sometimes serve as expert witnesses in the tribunal. We will provide political backing for the prosecutor when he tries to get people arrested. And all of this goes to try to increase the chances of the people responsible for atrocities being brought to justice. And believe me, if you're a dictator, the last thing you want is to find yourself in prison. So if we can increase the chance of dictators going to jail once they commit atrocities of this sort, we can actually deter them. We can discourage them from committing these kinds of crimes. So these are examples of how we get things done. None of this is soft. All of this is playing hardball. And that is a lot of our effectiveness. We very much are determined to maximize the pressure on an abusive government until it changes. Now, there are certain principles that we abide by in doing this work. First of all, the principles that we uphold are those of international law. International human rights or international humanitarian law are codified in treaties that most governments of the world have ratified. And those are the treaties, that's the law, the principles that we look to as we try to enforce human rights standards and values. But we also, coming back to management questions, we insist on a very high standard of professionalism by our staff. Our staff, when they walk into a foreign ministry, when they go and see a journalist, when they visit with the abusive government themselves, always maintain very high standards of professionalism. We're not out there throwing stones or throwing eggs. We don't lead demonstrations in the street. We walk into the office in our business suit, and we sit down as we would one diplomat to another. Our message is often not very diplomatic. Our message may be, you keep this up and you're going to jail. But we say it politely and professionally. Now, we also insist on maintaining the highest standards in our work. So our reporting is scrupulously objective and extraordinarily accurate. We have an internal fact-checking process and vetting process where we insist that everything that goes out is 100% accurate. And that's important because our credibility is a key source of our influence. And so we train our researchers and we then supervise them in order to make sure that we do maintain the highest standards of quality in the work that we produce. We also aim high in our work. Many NGOs may be happy to sort of see the third deputy assistant secretary at the embassy. We ask for the foreign minister. And we regularly meet with the presidents of countries, with prime ministers of countries, with ministers around the world. A number of people have compared Human Rights Watch to a medium-sized government in terms of our influence. And it's funny, but in an odd way that's true. If you spend time at the United Nations, what you quickly recognize is that most governments are worried about a bunch of different things. And their diplomats are very busy, and they can't focus on anything for too long, and they're happy for issues to just go away. It's very rare for a government to really try to drive something through to completion. And one thing that we look for when we hire staff is staff that is determined, that they really have that entrepreneurial spirit and are determined to get something done. And we have the advantage of being able to focus on one thing, human rights. So what I've often found is that one or two well-informed individuals can change global politics. They can walk into a meeting at the United Nations, they'll know more than anybody else in the room, and they'll be much more determined to get something done. And that gives them the power that in many ways is equivalent to a medium-sized government. And we're often compared in those terms. So again, this is an indication that we aim high. We're not an NGO that's content to protest on the street. We're an NGO that insists on being in the mix, engaging in politics, and getting things done. And that ethos is a lot of, again, the effectiveness, the impact of Human Rights Watch. Now, how do we build an organization like this? It was mentioned that we're in the middle. George Soros has just made it a huge investment, $10 million a year for 10 years in Human Rights Watch. And he's asked us to match that. But part of the reason for that is to allow us to continue to build the organization. First of all, to add more researchers, because in many countries we don't have enough people. We may have one person covering 2 or 3 countries when we actually need 2 or 3 researchers on one country. Our aim at this point is if we can have one researcher for each major country, we'd be happy. But we're not there yet. So we're trying to invest in bringing in more researchers. On the advocacy side, we're trying to expand the number of influential capitals where we can deploy our information. So 5 years ago, we were only in the major Western capitals. We opened up Tokyo, our office here, a few years ago because of the importance of Japan as an influential power, particularly in Asia. We're now in the process of opening up offices in India, in South Africa, in Brazil, in various influential southern governments, because we want them to be using their influence on behalf of human rights the same way that we might ask the Japanese government or the US government or the British government. So those are areas where we're trying to invest right now. To give you a sense of how this works, just kind of a couple examples in practice. We've all been very focused on what's been going on in the Middle East and North Africa. In Egypt, at the height of the uprising there, the Tahrir Square revolution, you may remember that at first the police were attacking the demonstrators, then the police were withdrawing and letting thugs come in and attack the demonstrators. Human Rights Watch had people on the ground in Tahrir Square monitoring what was going on. And this was a situation where we didn't have time to write a report. If we put a report out and it doesn't come out for another week, it's too late. The demonstrators have already been beaten up and tortured. So we were putting out information in real time, using Twitter, using satellite phones when the BlackBerries and the mobile phones wouldn't work, using whatever it took to get information out. And we were deploying that information not only in the press, but also with key governments. And actually, in this case, the most important government was the US government, because you may know that the US government gives the Egyptian military $1.5 billion of aid every year. So guess who the Egyptian government listens to? Washington has influence there. So our researchers in Tahrir Square would email or text our advocate in Washington, who would pick up the phone, get his friends in the White House, and relay the latest information, and ask the White House then to put pressure on the Egyptian military to stand in and protect the demonstrators. And at one point, US Vice President Biden was calling his counterpart in Egypt, Vice President Suleiman, and saying, you've got to deploy the military to protect the demonstrators. And like that, things stopped. Once Biden got on the phone, that's what the Egyptians needed to hear. So there was a kind of a circle of information, beginning with what was happening on the ground in Tahrir Square. Our researchers would report it, and very quickly, it would get to the key people in the White House who could enlist senior US officials to call their Egyptian counterparts to end the crackdown on the demonstrators. And you could see the impact within less than 24 hours. It all moved very, very quickly as it had to. Another example to illustrate the importance of our global advocacy stems from our recent work on Libya. In the early days when there was the rebel uprising there, Gaddafi was threatening to take Benghazi, the principal rebel city, and massacre everybody who had risen up against him. And we were trying to get the UN Security Council to condemn this, to impose sanctions on Gaddafi, and to send Libya to the International Criminal Court so that Gaddafi would be threatened with prosecution. The problem is that at the UN Security Council, you can only get them to act if the 5 permanent members agree. The permanent members are the US, the UK, and France. They were easy. They were already on our side. But also Russia and China. And China in particular was not on our side. China was threatening to veto any Security Council action. So what do? Well, we obviously talked to the Chinese, but we weren't getting any place there at first. So our strategy was to try to isolate the Chinese. Today, the most important members of the Security Council from the Global South are Brazil, India, and South Africa. Those are the governments that China looks to as sort of its peers. And so our strategy was to get Brazil, South Africa, and India on our side with respect to Libya. And the process, it was a funny one, actually. The key thing that mattered here is something we never would have predicted in advance. But the Libyan mission in New York, the Libyan mission to the UN, defected. They basically said, we want nothing to do with Gaddafi's repression, we quit. But Gaddafi had not replaced the Libyan mission yet. So we went to the former Libyan mission, but they were still sitting in the same building. And we said, would you mind writing a letter to the Security Council inviting the International Criminal Court to come and examine Libya? Now, at a certain level, this had no meaning whatsoever. The diplomats had already defected. They didn't really represent the country. But since nobody had replaced them yet, they still had an aura of legitimacy to them. So they wrote the letter, and everybody knew what was going on, but they sort of played along. And South Africa, which was, in a sense, the leading African government on the Security Council, said, well, if the Libyan representatives are inviting the International Criminal Court, we don't object. They knew this was a game, but they played along with the game. And so suddenly, South Africa agreed to support the resolution of the Security Council. And so then Brazil and India said, well, if the leading African government is supporting this resolution, we'll support it too. And so suddenly, the 3 key southern powers, Brazil, South Africa, and India, all were supporting this critical resolution on Libya. This all took place on a Saturday afternoon. And by 5 o'clock in the afternoon, it was clear that everybody but China was on board. So the Chinese ambassador kind of raised his hand and said, I'd like an adjournment, please. I need to consult with my capital. And he quickly got on the phone and woke up everybody in Beijing and got his instructions and came back at 8 p.m., all smiles, and said, I'm on board. And so China ended up going along with the resolution, which was adopted unanimously by the Security Council. And it showed the importance of this kind of global advocacy, the importance of being able to find allies around the world, not just in the traditional democracies. And Human Rights Watch is trying to do more and more of that as we build up our capacity to project our information around the world. Now, how do we finance all of this? That's obviously an important business school question. You can't build an organization if you don't know where the revenue is going to come from. And to make the question harder, Human Rights Watch, as a matter of principle, does not take any money from governments. After all, our business is to criticize governments. We can't very well take money from them and turn around and criticize them. We would have to worry about where our next paycheck came from, or we'd have to worry about being compromised. So we have a strict principle, no government money. Now, one traditional way has been to collect money through the mail or through the internet. But that's a very slow and inefficient process. And so Human Rights Watch has developed a revenue scheme which focuses on so-called major donors, people who are willing to make significant investments in our work. And we have been able to convince people to make quite substantial investments. For example, there are about 100 people or families who invest more than $100,000 a year in Human Rights Watch. These are people around the world, about 100 different individuals and families investing $100,000 a year. There are 8 families who invest over $1 million a year in Human Rights Watch. Now, these are major investments. But we've been able to convince people to invest like this because they see the payback. They see the impact. They see that their money is making a difference, that we run a lean and mean, efficient organization that makes a difference in the world. Now, not everybody gives at that huge level, but we have, I think, 800 people who give $5,000 a year or more. And then, of course, tens of thousands of people who give lesser amounts. But we've really built the organization over quite substantial contributions. Now, how do we attract that? One is obviously by demonstrating our impact. We meet with groups of people and we explain what we do and we explain how we make a difference. And I find there's no better way to attract a significant contribution than to show how it's going to make a difference. We also, because shaming is so important, we focus a lot on the press. And so people don't have to just listen to me or listen to Kenai in describing our impact. They can read it in the newspaper because the press covers our work extensively. And that also helps to attract donors. The professionalism that I described in terms of how we approach governments also helps to attract significant contributions. Because if somebody's going to be a very successful business person, they want an NGO that has the same professionalism in its operations as they would expect at the office. And so again, the culture of the organization lends itself to attracting these kinds of significant contributions. One of the most successful things we've done is that we've set up a series of committees around the world. There's one here in Tokyo. We have, I think at this point, 18 committees in different major cities. And each of these committees is composed of people who are significant contributors to the organization. The committees also help us do advocacy and outreach, and perhaps most important, they do networking. They bring in their friends. So, the members of the Tokyo Committee, tonight we're having a major fundraising dinner here in Tokyo. And the members are inviting their friends to the dinner. And so the friends will show up and they'll learn about Human Rights Watch, and a lot of them will get excited. And so next year they'll buy a table and they'll invite their friends. And that networking is a very important way of building a revenue base, of attracting donors. And people like to have peers around. And so it's very helpful to have these committees so that when a significant donor becomes interested in Human Rights Watch, they can look around the room and see other people who they're comfortable with, who are also investing in Human Rights Watch. And obviously, by doing this on a global level, we expand the revenue options. So we are not dependent on any one country. And in fact, we're regularly adding countries. We just opened an office in Beirut and are bringing in new donors from the Middle East. We're looking to donors in Brazil and Mexico and South Africa. In many of these places where we're opening up, we also are attracting donors to try to create a genuinely global donor base. One thing that we found is that in addition to doing regular fundraising, it's important periodically to launch a campaign. And that's one way that we sort of get additional money to grow. It may seem odd, but if somebody's giving X amount a year, and if you launch a campaign with a specific goal in mind, people will often increase their gift. The first time we did this was to create an endowment. Now, this was a somewhat audacious thing to do at the beginning because when we started doing research, we realized that no advocacy organization that we could find had ever created an endowment. Endowments were things that universities created, or hospitals, institutions that had big campuses and lots of buildings and looked really permanent. They were the ones who could raise an endowment, because endowments, obviously, kind of by definition, are there for the long term. But how do you demonstrate that an advocacy organization is going to be around for the long term? That was our challenge. And we had to demonstrate to our donor base that, first of all, the problem of human rights violations was not going to go away. But second, that Human Rights Watch had established a stature in the world that we weren't going to go away either, that we were now a key and permanent part of the global defense of human rights. And it took convincing our donors of that to get them to then contribute, in addition to their annual support, to make an extra contribution to the endowment. And today we have an endowment of over $80 million, which generates revenue every year toward our operations. Obviously, it's still a small part of our overall operations, but a significant contribution nonetheless. We did another campaign after that, trying to expand our operations. At that point, we were a $20 million organization. And we did a 5-year campaign and more than doubled the size of the organization in those 5 years. And as was mentioned, we've just started a third campaign under George Soros's Challenge Grant, where we're trying to build the organization from where it started off at 48 million. We're trying to bring it up to 80 million in the course of 5 years. And that's the challenge that we're currently in the middle of in order to allow us to broaden our research capacity and to extend our advocacy reach into these different key capitals of the global south. Now, it's not just a matter of money, obviously. Another key element of a successful organization is staff, is hiring good people. And here there are certain principles that we have followed at Human Rights Watch. One is we try to hire the smartest, most capable people we can find. We do global searches for every one of our positions. We get flooded with applications. We'll open up a position for a researcher and we'll get 500 applications, including people with incredible backgrounds. So we are fortunate to be able to hire really good people. We want people with drive, as I mentioned. We don't want people who want a nice, little, comfortable, cushy job. We want people who wake up every morning and are hungry and say, how can I make a difference today? What can I do today to advance my issue? And it's that kind of drive every day that is critical to succeeding at Human Rights Watch. If people don't have that, they don't stay very long. They probably don't get hired in the first place. One key to retaining good people, and indeed attracting good people, is that we give a lot of responsibility to people. I mentioned that we do have oversight. So it's not as if people are completely on their own, but nonetheless, there's an enormous deference to expertise. So, who is the person on our staff who knows the most about Japanese foreign policy? It's Kanai. And she is making 90% of the decisions about what she's going to do with her day and how she's going to advance our work here in Japan. And I could say the same thing about our researcher on Libya or our advocate in Brussels. We hire good people, they develop expertise, and then we defer to that expertise. We're very unusual in that we don't have 1 or 2 or 3 spokespeople. In some NGOs, the CEO is the person who always appears in the press. That would kill Human Rights Watch if I was the only one who was speaking to the press. We probably have 150 people who speak to the press, because whoever is the expert, we put forward. And that gets journalists to call us more, because our people will know more than the journalists. We make sure of that. And that gets the journalists calling back more and more. One of the big things that keep people interested in Human Rights Watch is there's enormous value added to being part of the organization. If you're a journalist or an academic or a lawyer, you may be making a difference in your day-to-day work. But if you join Human Rights Watch, that difference multiplies tremendously. Because suddenly, your reports are getting much more press attention. You're getting to see government officials at a much more senior level. Everything gets taken more seriously. And so that, again, is part of what allows us to retain staff and attract the best staff. Because nobody wants to waste their time. And they see that if they can do their work as part of Human Rights Watch, they can get much more done than if they were operating on their own. Now, the other part that I'll just mention is the board. Because every NGO has a board of directors. And one of the difficult things is how do you get the balance right between the role of a board and the role of the staff? There's nothing that would kill Human Rights Watch more quickly than to have the board of directors think that it's going to be making day-to-day decisions. There's no way. The world moves much too quickly. We've got to decide like that. If there's an event, we've got to find out what happened, put out our press release, develop our advocacy strategy, often within just hours. And the idea of convening the board of directors to decide this is impossible. So you have to develop principles as to what is a board issue and what is a staff issue. And the board is involved in setting the broad strategy of the organization, enforcing the principles of the organization, overseeing the budget, helping with the fundraising, but it can't possibly run day to day. And I should say the same thing goes for me. As CEO, I can't pretend to make every single decision or anything close to it. The key to a nimble, fast-moving organization is delegation. And we try to keep that principle throughout the organization and to push responsibility as far down the organization hierarchy as we can and as close to the experts as we can. And we want as many decisions, as I mentioned, made by those experts as possible. Now, we do keep the board involved in our work in part through various committees that we establish that oversee things like budget or the investment in our endowment or our communications policy or things of that sort. We also periodically bring the board into the field. And so every year and a half, one of our board meetings is held in one of the countries where we're doing important work. This coming October, the board is going to meet in Bogota, Colombia, because Colombia has been a site of a very substantial and ugly war for many, many years, and things are finally moving in a positive direction. There's a new president there who has been very receptive to our concerns. In fact, as soon as he was elected, he called us up and said, "What do you want me to do?" And we actually gave him a formal plan, much of which he's doing. And it's such a positive change, we wanted to bring the board there to kind of reinforce this new direction for the government. We recently met, the board has met in India, it's met in Egypt, it's met in Nigeria, in Russia, different countries at different times. We also have a series of advisory committees for each part of the world where we bring on experts who help advise our staff as to the best way to approach this or that country or this or that issue. And I've already mentioned, of course, the city committees that we've established, which are a way of bringing our donors into the organization and connecting them with our research, because our researchers will regularly speak to these committees, and that's a way of sort of really having a first-hand understanding of the work that we're doing without necessarily having to travel to those countries. Now, let me just conclude by saying that I've kind of described for you how we've gotten to where we are today. But one thing that is clear is that NGOs cannot rest on their laurels. If an NGO is going to be successful, it's got to wake up every day and figure out what it has to do that's new or different. Because you may not think of the NGO world as competitive. You may think of the kind of the business world as competitive. But the NGO world is competitive too. And if you are not kind of at the top of your game, if you're not constantly pushing forward, you risk losing your edge and losing your position, losing your impact. journalists will stop calling as often. Governments will stop paying as much attention. Donors will move on to other issues. And so it's important to maintain an ethos within the organization to constantly figure out, what is the next thing? How do we have to change to be better? How do we increase our impact? That's what led us to this campaign that we're in the middle of today, because we realized that global power was shifting, and we could no longer count simply on the traditional democracies to promote human rights. That power was shifting to other parts of the world, and if we didn't enlist those new powers, we would lose influence as a movement. So that's kind of the direction we're moving in now, but there's going to be a new direction tomorrow. And so, for me, the bottom line principle is that, while we don't have a bottom line in terms of profit or a financial bottom line, we still do have a bottom line in terms of impact. And I've described for you today how we have an impact, but it may be different tomorrow. And the key to running a successful organization is to be alert to that possibility and to constantly figure out, is there a way to do it better, and to be willing to change. And just as a successful corporation will be a dynamic corporation, similarly a successful NGO has to be attuned to, in a sense, the competitive marketplace in which it works, and constantly strive to accomplish its mission more successfully with more impact in a better way. So let me conclude there, and Yoshi, I guess we're going to have a conversation, and then we'll open it up to all your questions. Thank you very much.
Okay. Go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. That was a very insightful and impressive speech, and I have learned a lot. Thank you very much for coming to Globis.
My pleasure.
And I happened to meet Ken at Davos this year in January, and we sat down for about 30 minutes, and I liked him. I was so impressed. And after a while, I was invited to be on the committee of Human Rights Watch Japan, which I have attended about 4 weeks ago. And I heard that Ken is coming, and then I have proposed that why don't you have a speech in Globis so that we can have Twitters and also televised by internet, and so that lots of people have a strong awareness about human rights. Simply because in Japan, if you live in Japan, we don't see that kind of incidents so often. And so that we have to know about what's happening globally, and what is Human Rights Watch, and what you're doing, and what your concern is, and how you actually make the human rights better globally. So I'm so happy to be having you here. And at the same time, I have also tweeted your speech, and so that we are collecting some questions over the internet as well. And let me ask you one or two questions. One is that you mentioned about Human Rights Watch. I'd like to know about what are the 5 major human rights violations that you see right now, which are bothering you?
All right. Well, maybe I should start off. You mentioned Twitter. Let me do a quick advertisement before I answer your question. I mean, one is that Kanai Doi has her own Twitter account, and so I think it's at Kanai Doi, right? So I would encourage you to follow her, and if you want, she does it in Japanese, and I do it in English. So if you want to follow me, mine is at Ken Roth, K-E-N-R-O-T-H. But that's a good way to kind of keep up on our work through those 2 Twitter accounts, or you can follow the Human Rights Watch one, which is just at HRW. Now, in terms of, Yoshi, where are we looking around the world? It's difficult to answer that because it obviously varies almost from moment to moment. We've been putting an enormous amount of emphasis recently in trying to defend the Arab Spring. I was actually just in Egypt, and Human Rights Watch was the first human rights organization to meet with the military that is currently running the government. And it was an odd meeting, I've got to say, because they were not used to these kind of meetings. They were at one point. It was a 2-hour meeting. I mean, it was a very serious meeting. But at one point, I started trying to explain to the general how it's not appropriate for them to be arresting people and trying them in military courts. That that's not what you do in a democracy. And he blew up at me and said, like, who are you to tell me this? And it's like, he just didn't, this had never happened to him before. So we had to sort of calm him down and explain that this is a normal conversation, at another point, I was saying, you really have to stop calling up journalists and intimidating them every time that they criticize you. And he said, it's okay for them to criticize us. They just can't accuse us of things. I still don't understand that distinction. And he said, in any event, I just call them in for an American cup of coffee. As if nothing nefarious can ever happen over an American cup of coffee. But it was, Egypt is obviously, one big concern because the transition is very incomplete. Mubarak is gone, but the military, while I don't think it wants to keep power, it's quite unsure about how it wants to handle this transition. And Egypt being the biggest, most influential government of the region, what happens there matters elsewhere. So that's one big area. To take another example, though, in Syria, where Assad is just, killing as many demonstrators as he can to try to cling to power, we are trying to get the Security Council to act. And it's been harder than in the case of Libya. In Libya, there were a number of things that went our way, which I described. But one of the problems we've had is because NATO, arguably overstepped its mandate and has not been simply protecting civilians in Libya, but has been engaged in regime change, suddenly nobody wants to authorize anything close to that in Syria. And even though nobody's talking about a military intervention in Syria, China and Russia are trying to block even condemnations of Syria. And so we've been trying to put pressure on Syria as best we can. The Security Council has not been working. We were able to get the Human Rights Council to launch a commission of inquiry. We've been able to get sanctions imposed. We're doing the things that we can, but it's been tough. A different part of the world, Sudan is going through a transition right now. And this month, the world's newest country is going to be born, South Sudan. Yes. Now, that divorce is going to proceed all right. But the problem is that some of the border areas are currently the focus of very ugly conflict. There's one area called Southern Kordofan, and within that is an area called the Nuba Mountains. And in the Nuba Mountains, there has been a rebel group that sympathizes with South Sudan, but is located in regular Sudan, in the north. And the Sudanese government has been brutally attacking people there. And so we've been trying to get word out about that and increase pressure on Sudan to stop these atrocities. There are other more perennial issues in eastern Congo, where there's a huge problem of rape. We've been working to create a brand new kind of half international, half national tribunal to try to prosecute the rapists, because the national courts are just not working. But we've been able to convince the government that if they invite in international jurists, that will give more credibility to the court, it'll make it function better, and it may be a way of deterring this kind of rape. In Sri Lanka, in this part of the world, you may remember that just a couple of years ago, at the end of the war against the Tamil Tigers, the government massacred through kind of arbitrary shelling an estimated 40,000 people, the number given by the recent UN report.
Those are 5 already.
Yeah, I can keep going, but that's, these
Okay.
are,
So you mentioned Egypt, Syria, Sudan, and Congo, and Sri Lanka. And in case of Japan, the closest nation that will come up to my mind will be China. Because when I watched the website of Human Rights Watch, Ai Weiwei, the picture of Ai Weiwei came up right in the center. How do you see the situation of China? And what is the Nobel laureate was still arrested while he was given the Nobel Award. What do you think is happening, and how do you see the situation of China now?
well, China today is going through the most intense crackdown on dissent since Tiananmen Square. So in 20 years. Now, what's the cause of that? A lot of it is that you may recall that the first revolution in Tunisia was called the Jasmine Revolution. And someone had the idea of calling for jasmine rallies in China. And they knew that they couldn't simply have big public demonstrations that the Chinese security forces would stop them. So instead, they asked people in about a dozen cities on Sunday afternoons to simply go walking in the shopping area, figuring the police couldn't tell the difference between the shoppers and the demonstrators. This terrified the Chinese security apparatus. And they have been arresting dissidents like Ai Weiwei. They've been censoring the internet. They've been doing everything they can to try to prevent a Jasmine anything from emerging in China. And what it represents, I think, is a very brittle government. I mean, we think of China as being an economic powerhouse, but at home, it's scared. By its own count, there are something like 100,000 incidents of public unrest every year, something like 300 a day. And these are people who are discontent because corrupt local officials are seizing their lands or polluting the environment or extorting funds. And there's no place to go. The courts are not independent. Civil society is shut down. The press is censored. And so people demonstrate and are often arrested. The government, one of the real challenges it faces is how to rein in these corrupt local officials without allowing the usual tools of a free press and an independent court system. And they don't know how to do that. And what they're terrified of is that these many, many incidents of local unrest will turn into another national incident, like what happened 20 years ago with Tiananmen Square. And they are so scared that they are now cracking down at a time when you would think they'd be confident. Here they are, economically booming, and they're terrified that they have lost legitimacy at home. And so that's trying to fight that crackdown is a major preoccupation of Human Rights Watch.
You have mentioned about how you shame dictators. And dictators do not want to be shamed. And then dictators have come up to the power by using violence in most of the cases, or some illegal activities. And have you ever faced any situation where you have been threatened in terms of the safety of yourself or your staffs, or some kind of sacrifices made by not being able to get into the country, or do you have any that kind of incidents?
Yeah. Well, our staff has faced threats. And there have been times when we've had to pull people out of countries because of threats. I should say that, the security of our staff is a very high priority for us. And even though we do send staff into war zones and into dictatorships, we have very close consultation about trying to minimize the risk. You can never eliminate the risk, and everybody who works for us understands that. But we do try to reduce it. And there are various things we do in terms of communication and when people can travel and how they can travel and things of that sort to try to reduce the risk. As you alluded to, there are times when governments just try to keep us out. And we try to go into countries openly because we try to engage in dialogue with the government. We want to meet with the government. But if they're not going to meet with us, if they're going to try to keep us out, we have no qualms about sneaking in. And we will sneak in places. We do it all the time. Because for us, the premium is getting the information.
Don't you get arrested, or don't you get under custody, or haven't you ever faced that kind of situation by sneaking in? Or?
Well, people have been arrested here and there and expelled, but nothing serious. And often when we sneak in, we sneak out too. So no, more typically we don't get arrested.
You have mentioned about using power. In Globis, we have a course called Power and Influence. And in order to enact something, or to do something tough, you have to have some power and influence. How do you categorize power, and how do you access them, and how do you influence them to do the way that you think that they want to be doing?
Well, first of all, our power comes from the values that we represent. And these values are broadly shared values. If we were to put out a report about, government X cracks down on its dissidents, and if everybody applauded and said, good job, we would have no power. But instead, because people find it shameful when governments try to silence their critics, we have a lot of power. And that power comes from the fact that we reflect global values. And so that's, I mentioned at one point that, our principles are those of international law, which broadly respect the values that people have, that you have a right not to be executed, a right not to be tortured, a right not to be censored, a right not to be thrown in jail arbitrarily. I mean, these are all rights that are broadly accepted. And so that's our power. What we do is, given those global values, we can then reflect a government's misconduct against those. And by showing that a government is falling short of those global values, we get power. But the power ultimately is derivative from the fact that we represent values that are broadly shared.
In terms of categorization, one is like maybe power to be able to use media, one way, or you mentioned about the government, and maybe international, some institutions like World Bank and United Nations, and then maybe to appeal to the public as well, and at the same time, you may talk to some other like legal, like you mentioned about the prosecution. So you use that kind of power depending upon who the dictators might think or might be reliant on.
Exactly, exactly.
Very good. One more question, and I'd like to open up. What do you expect the Japanese government or Japanese people to do? Like now that you're here in Japan after March 11th, and the event dinner on April 5th, wasn't it? Was canceled because of the earthquake, but now you are here. What do you expect Japanese government and Japanese people to do for Human Rights Watch?
Well, let me say two things. I mean, first, in terms of the Japanese government, the Japanese government is potentially very influential. It is, by far and away the biggest aid provider in this part of the world. The problem is that it doesn't really use its influence on behalf of human rights. That for the most part, Japanese foreign policy is conducted as if human rights are irrelevant. Now we're trying to change that. And we made some progress under Foreign Minister Okada, who began to speak out about human rights with respect to Burma and Sri Lanka, and it was suddenly, changing things. But when he was kicked upstairs, I guess, and became number 2 in the Democratic Party, he was no longer foreign minister, and the 2 ministers who have succeeded him are the old school, and they don't really talk about human rights. So, one thing we want to do is to have Japan live up to its potential. It should be one of the global leaders on human rights, and it's not. In terms of Japanese individuals, we'd like, first of all, people should raise this with the government, in the press. This should be something that people talk about. And obviously, we need economic support, not simply to maintain our operations here in Tokyo, but also to maintain operations around the world. Because, as I mentioned, it's an expensive proposition to be fielding researchers in 90 countries.
During your visit here, I heard that you just arrived last night.
Yes.
And do you have any appointments with bureaucrats or politicians who could be your friends in terms of the influencing human rights activities?
Yeah, this is a short trip, so I'm only here for 2 days, but we are seeing the Deputy Foreign Minister tomorrow. Yes.
Very good. I hope next time you come, I'd like to arrange some more politicians to come over to this kind of event so that their awareness will be up. Okay, so I'd like to open up for the floor, and then also, there are some questions coming in from the internet. And do you have any questions to Kenra? Shreya? Okay, Andrew.
The mic, because it's on video.
Okay, you can start, Andrew, if you like. And then you.
Hello, Andreas Borde. I'm one of the IMBA students of 2010, and was a nice speech. I'm very surprised. I have one issue what I want to change the focus a little bit from these current countries like Libya, like Egypt and Afghanistan towards the US, which is supposed to be a role model first. However, we have the case of Guantanamo. We also have the case that the US were supporting those countries, especially like Mubarak, Gaddafi in former times. And how do you see this, and how is the evaluation? Should we not also focus on these kind of issues that the US, as being a powerful organization or a powerful country which can influence this, that this is not a point what we should also consider? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I should say that even though I made my presentation in terms of dictators, we also work on democracies. And the US is a good example of that. We've been extremely critical of both the Bush administration and now the Obama administration for continuing Guantanamo, We're critical of Bush for torturing suspects. We've been critical of Obama for not investigating and prosecuting the torturers. So that's a big part of what we do. And I've met with President Obama himself and discussed these issues directly in the White House. In terms of US foreign policy, we closely monitor and criticize it. And so, sometimes we can get the US to do the right thing when they, called Vice President Suleiman in Egypt. But at the same time, other times they're supporting dictatorships way too long. And I mean, even Assad, Hillary Clinton was calling Assad a reformer when he was, already killing people. And so we spend a lot of our time, we have a significant office in Washington, speaking with, the State Department, with the White House, providing them with our information, sometimes working with them constructively to enlist their help, but sometimes criticizing them quite publicly in the press for doing the wrong thing. And that's one way we get them to move toward doing the right thing.
Any other people? Okay, maybe you.
Yeah. I am a journalist and staying in Egypt for 4 years in 1990s. And recently, the Ratko Mladic was arrested, former Yugoslavian, and he 15 years ago that he killed 7,000 people in Srebrenica, and now he is in custody. And at that time, Human Rights Watch also praised NATO to bomb them. It was the first time I remember. And now the NATO also attacks Libya. And do you think the same thing will happen in Libya like Yugoslavia, and Gaddafi will be the next Ratko Mladic in future? How do you think?
Yeah. Well, yes, I do. But let me let me give a bit of background for those who are not familiar with it. But Ratko Mladic, whom you mentioned, was the Bosnian Serb military leader, who, among other things, was the guy in Srebrenica who was, handing out candy to the children as he was picking up their brothers and fathers, marching them off, and massacring them. Killed 7,000 people, and committed an act of genocide there. He was indicted by the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and spent 15 years in hiding in and around Belgrade. Now, this was an area, it was a very high priority for Human Rights Watch to get Serbia to surrender Mladic to The Hague. But the Serbian military was protecting Mladic. And so we started saying, well, what does Serbia really want? What Serbia wanted was to join the European Union. And we were able to convince the European Union to say, no, Serbia doesn't get to enter until they hand over Mladic. And the government that was firmest in that case was the Dutch government, the Netherlands, because its troops had been in Srebrenica when Mladic committed those atrocities. And finally, the day that Catherine Ashton, the European Union, in a sense, foreign minister, their high representative, she was about to go to Belgrade, that day they arrested Mladic and turned him over. So it showed that, pressure works, that if you really make it clear that they're not going to get what they want unless they do the right thing, they do the right thing. Now, in the case of Gaddafi, he's been indicted by the International Criminal Court. There's an arrest warrant that's been issued for him. He is, I don't know whether he's going to fight to the bitter end the way he says he's going to. At some point, I suspect he's going to cut and run. And then we're going to have to put pressure on wherever he ends up to surrender him to The Hague. But it's very important that these people be brought to justice, because our aim is not simply to do justice for his victims, but also to deter others. Because ideally, the next president who's facing a rebellion, I want them to think, if I start massacring people, I'm going to find myself in The Hague too. so I better not go that route. And that's when you start saving lives. So that's our aim. But we certainly are pushing hard for Gaddafi to be surrendered. We're pushing for Omar al-Bashir, the Sudanese president, to be surrendered, and many others who've been indicted or sought by these international tribunals.
Okay.
Gil Chavez, I am an instructor here at Globus IMBA. Regarding, it seems like you spend a lot of time depending on high wealth individuals to contribute. Mm-hmm. And recently I came across hedge funds that were investing heavily in countries that were run by dictatorships, things like that. How much time do you spend in vetting these kinds of wealthy individuals regarding?
Yeah. Well, we do vet them. We actually have certain principles that govern who will accept funds from and who not. And so, for example, there's certain industries where we do quite a bit of work. One as an example would be the extraction industries, oil and gas and mining. And because these companies tend to operate in highly abusive countries and are often a very significant revenue source in these countries and are sometimes complicit in serious abuse, we do quite a bit of reporting on those countries, on those companies. And because of that reporting, we then have a rule that we won't accept money from them, from the companies or from their CEOs or directors, because that would be an obvious conflict of interest. We can't be, seen to be, taking payoffs in order not to report on somebody, so we just don't take money from the industry at all. And that's how we deal with that. We don't do it on a country basis. We do it on an industry basis, because we actually don't object to people investing in countries, even a place like China. The issue is, how do you invest? And we ask people to invest in a way that is respectful of human rights. So we ask them to avoid complicity in human rights, but we judge that by their conduct, not simply by the country that they're in.
Yes.
I was going to ask the same question, just like previous, but maybe repeat my question. My name is Hideki Wakabayashi, Executive Director of Amnesty International, Japan, here in Japan. And please keep in mind that there's another big international human rights NGOs, as well as Human Rights Watch. Okay, and my question is, we have very strict rules and guidelines when you deal with a corporation. You just mentioned that the multinational corporation violates something, human rights. But for example, do you have more specific rules and guidelines when you deal with? For example, we are not allowed to review CSR report published by corporation. We don't give any education, human rights education to the corporation when we get overpaid or something like this. So we have very strict rules, and could you explain a little bit, corroborate after, besides what you have said too?
Yeah, well, we probably have very similar rules. Let me just say by just introductory that, Amnesty International is a great organization, and we work very closely with Amnesty. We view Amnesty as our principal international ally. And Amnesty and Human Rights Watch are really the two big global organizations. We have slightly different methodologies, but very much pushing in the same direction. And it's a very important partnership. It's a good 1-2 punch. Now, in terms of corporations, we similarly, we do regularly meet with corporations and offer them advice about how to better respect human rights. We would never accept funds for that. We need that to be just a completely financially neutral relationship. So if there is a business or an industry that we're dealing with programmatically, we do not turn that into a funding relationship. We keep that completely separate. And it's important to maintain those kind of conflict of interest standards.
Any other questions? Okay, yes.
Thank you very much. I'm an employee at Globus, and my question is related to the Japanese individuals' awareness. You briefly mentioned that the most important thing we need to do as an individual is to raise awareness towards this issue, but also in the beginning you mentioned that not only to Human Rights Watch, but towards NPO, the Japanese individual image seems soft and ineffective, according to your word, relative to maybe other countries. So I've been living in Japan quite some time already, so I would be interested to know what's your view towards Japanese individual relative to other advanced countries' residents towards these types of issues, whether the level of awareness is much lower or that kind of your impression towards Japan.
Well, I mean, I don't know Japan well enough to say why, but my impression is both that civil society is weaker here than it is in other democracies, and also that sort of the level of awareness of these kind of issues is less here than in other major democracies. I view that as an opportunity. I mean, I think that one thing that Human Rights Watch wants to accomplish in Japan is to build public awareness, because as the public becomes more knowledgeable about these issues, it will begin to insist on its government playing a more active role. And it will also help to build a civil society that's more engaged in these issues. But I think there's a lot of work to be done.
One more hand up. Yes, please.
Thank you for giving me time. My name is Shinsuke Takagi. Now out of work, so I'm a non-profit person. Then I am interested in your evaluation system for your organization itself and staff. I assume that your project is longer term than ordinary company, and you mentioned the definition of success is impact, not finance. So I think it is the success is more vague or not specific, I think. Then from that point, what aspect you focus on the staff success or growth or achievement of, for example, annual or some periodical achievement of your organization?
You know, that's a good question. It's on the question of impact. I mean, yes, at a certain level, it's vague, but because we know how to have an impact, and it's the strategy that I outlined, you can measure whether progress is being made. Not necessarily, you know, did torture end this year, but is the staff person successful in building up pressure on the government to stop torture, say? Because we know over time that if pressure is sustained, the government will change. So we can evaluate staff members by whether they're successful in building up pressure. And there are lots of different ways to do that. It can be through the press, it can be through, you know, getting powerful governments to use their influence. It can be through other creative ways, you know, getting civil society mobilized. It can be, you know, getting prosecutors interested. But we need to see progress toward putting pressure on the government. And if we see that, we're confident that we'll have an impact over time. So those are the kind of the interim measures that we use in judging success.
Okay, we have 5 more minutes. Let me ask you 1 or 2 questions. One is that you mentioned that you are tough. You are far away from softness. And but if you are tough, that means that will shame people, dictators, and you will make quite a few enemies. You know, what drives you so much? Like how your energy comes up, and why you are so tough, and why you can keep on doing it?
Yeah, I mean, you're right about the enemies. You know, but it's you just accept that. No, look at what drives me. I think what drives most of the staff is seeing that we're making a difference. I mean, it can be extraordinarily fulfilling to know that you're changing people's lives for the better. And that I think that's what gets people up in the morning. That's what keeps them working so hard. They see that they're making a difference. And I think many people feel privileged to have that opportunity. So motivation is not a big problem. I mean, once you start doing this work and you see what a difference you're making, it's very motivating.
One question came from the internet is that, are there any countries where most of the people are with dictator, where they don't want you to come in? And if there are a country like that, what would you do?
Well, there aren't. I mean, it's, you know, it's, I mean, I've never met somebody, you know, who, you know, wants to be tortured or who wants to be censored or, you know, who
Yeah.
wants to be imprisoned arbitrarily. I mean, those are not widely held desires. So no, I mean, I think everybody wants our involvement. I mean, there are certain, you know, sensitive issues, you know, the rights of women in certain societies or the rights of sexual minorities in certain societies, religious freedom in certain societies. These are tough issues. And sometimes it's better for us as Human Rights Watch not to take the lead, but rather to support local activists on these issues. But even there, I mean, take the, you know, the rights of women in a very conservative society. I mean, if you know, if some women want to just stay at home and be subordinate to the men, you know, fine, that's their choice. We don't object to that. But the women who want to be free and make their own decisions, those are the ones that we'll stand with. And if it's more effective, we'll do it ourselves. If it's more effective for us to work through a local partner, we'll do that. We figure out what's the best approach, and we'll proceed pragmatically.
The last question. When do you leave Japan this time, and what do you want to achieve during your visit here in Japan?
Well, unfortunately, this is a really quick trip. I'm just here for sort of 2 working days.
Okay.
So I'm really, Kanai has got me working. I think she's got me with 4 speaking engagements, a press conference, a big fundraising dinner tonight, a meeting with the deputy foreign minister, and I think I get to sleep a few hours in there. So, I'm just, at this point, we're doing kind of a lot of awareness building and that sort of work.
I think this kind of like a speech would help raising awareness of Japanese business community, because Globis has quite a big community behind us in terms of the businesses. And I hope that, you know, this speech has raised awareness of Japanese people and business communities towards Human Rights Watch activities. And in fact, I have learned a lot from your speech, and I'll be looking forward to seeing you tonight for dinner. And your colleague will be speaking tomorrow night on Human Rights Watch in Africa tomorrow. So that I'm also looking forward to it.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
So please give a hands of applause to Ken Ross for coming over to Globis for a speech. Thank you very much.